This is the Infrastructure Matters podcast, brought to you by the Futurum Group. We explore the latest developments in hybrid cloud computing and the technology that underpins it. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the hybrid cloud computing landscape. The Infrastructure Matters podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take anything reflected in this show as investment advice. Now your co-hosts, Steven Dickens, Camberley Bates, and Krista Macomber of the Futurum Group.
Good morning. Hey, this is Camberley Bates. We're back here with Infrastructure Matters, and my besties here, Krista Macomber is up in New Hampshire, Steve Dickens, who is in New York, and Camberley Bates, and I'm in Boulder, Colorado. So welcome to the next edition of this. We've got some great stuff lined up for you. First of all, a couple of announcements that we've had. It's August, so it's not quite as fast, and they're making us hold everything because we got two big shows coming up. Next week is VMware Explorer, and the week after that is Google Next. So there's lots of stuff coming out. We'll talk about those 2 weeks. But first, kind of what's been up and about. So Steve, you had something that you want to chat about. I think it had to do with Oracle.
Yeah, so I wrote a Forbes article covering the Open Enterprise Linux Association. There's been lots going on in the open source community over the last 6 weeks, maybe a bit longer. We had Magnus Hellickson, the GM of the Red Hat business, talking about some of their announcements that kind of kicked all this off on one of our shows. So we'll provide the show notes to that and the link. But really, this was SUSE, Oracle, and SIX getting together to really codify what they're going to do with support for a forked version of RHEL. So interesting. Why
are they doing another fork version of RHEL?
Well, so we had Alma and Rocky kind of doing that based off the CentOS kind of source. And Red Hat made some announcements of what their plans are for CentOS Stream as a sort of testing ground, if you will, for RHEL. As I say, Gunnar does a lot better job of it than me. But I think the net of this for me is choice is good. Community collaboration is good. Customers having options of what they want to do, whether that's they want to go and buy a commercial version from RHEL, whether they want to go and get support from SUSE or Oracle or work with the Open ELA. Whatever they want to do, I think the community's at its best when there's options and choices. So I think, the team at Red Hat are doing a great job of contributing and will continue to be one of the biggest contributors into the Linux kernel going forward. That's not going to change. But I think some of these kind of downstream support options, more choice is a good thing. So as I say, we'll put some links in the show notes to a couple of articles and things that if people want to double click, they can go there and find out more.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noted, and I can't say what vendor it was because I don't think it was public knowledge at this point. Big win at one of the big providers in the market space, and for a file system area. And that win was going to go on, the software was going to go on OCP, the Open Compute Project architectures. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of this interesting thing of, for a very long time, open source and open projects seem to be the back end stuff. Now, with the power of these hyperscalers and the super network guys like Facebook or Meta and those kind of folks, we see they're building their own products. So therefore, this open source, the openness of things are becoming viable and maybe features a bit more viable long term. And then I'll bring that out because one of the things that I didn't mention about Flash Memory Summit is the amount of announcements that we had on those kind of platforms or maybe kind of more open platforms. So consistently coming out from Western Digital with their OpenFlex Data 24 NVMe over Fabric offering. We saw Viking come out with their offer, Viking Enterprise Solutions, which is, big stack box with NVMe. Supermicro rolled out their big stack box. I mean, usually you think of them as servers, but they also have the storage product line that's out there. And so they seem to be making more move into it, and those moves are going into not necessarily the core enterprise companies, but they're going into some of these MSPs or larger cloud providers, et cetera, that are building their own environment. So I would kind of call those quasi-open. They're still proprietary, but not quite. So anyway, that's where that goes. So, Krista, go ahead.
Up and down the stack, we're seeing things get more and more open. I'll talk about some of the stuff I saw in the mainframe space this week around open. So it's interesting how, I think that going back to the Red Hat and CentOS and kind of OpenELA, it's the commercial models off the top of the open source code basis that are the interesting thing. But Krista, I cut in front of you.
Good. All yours, Krista. Yeah. You had some stuff that came up with AWS, I think.
Yes, yeah. So this was actually, a couple of weeks ago. AWS had its storage day, which I attended with our colleague Dave Raffa. So he and I actually put our heads together on a write-up, and similar to Steven, we'll make sure to put a link to that write-up in the show notes here. Specifically, kind of what I was interested in is the kind of data protection and cyber resiliency related announcements, especially considering the fact that we are seeing cloud storage is becoming very popular as a backup target, and even as kind of an air-gapped or long-term storage repository. So specifically, there was a few announcements coming out of the AWS storage days related to that. One was support for SnapLock for Amazon FSx for NetApp ONTAP. And the takeaway for this is the ability to use Amazon FSx to create immutable snapshots. And what I really liked about this in particular was that not only was there announced support for kind of just the general immutability, but also that there was the support for what they call kind of compliance modes. So the distinguishing factor here is that there is no role within the organization that can either change or remove or otherwise tamper with those designations for immutability. And we do see that is a requirement not only for compliance, as you might infer based on the name, but also increasingly based on some of these cyber attacks that we're seeing, where there might be a malicious actor that is able to kind of penetrate that storage repository based on hacked credentials or something like that. So that was one thing that was, to me, very interesting, and I think kind of an important capability from the standpoint of using AWS storage infrastructure for backups. They also had a couple other announcements. One was what they're calling a logically air-gapped storage vault hosted through AWS Backup. This storage environment also has the ability to create immutable backup copies. Encryption is enabled by default. And those kind of encryption keys are actually stored and managed by AWS. So the customer doesn't necessarily need to worry about that. Now, this is an interesting segment of the market because, as I was mentioning a couple minutes ago, we are seeing that there's interest in these kind of cloud-hosted, quote-unquote, air-gapped environments. But what's important is that we need to make sure that this isn't just us kind of, storing backup copies in any storage infrastructure. So really looking for additional capabilities to make sure that this environment is truly an air-gapped. And I think AWS is adding a couple of important features like that encryption, that immutability. I'll be keeping an eye on this space to see any other kind of additional controls and capabilities that they might be adding, such as the ability to validate data integrity, or maybe kind of to control, that air gapping process, and maybe sever the connection to that vault environment when data is not being transmitted into. Those are important features.
And I know there was a bunch of other ones that they, enhanced, like their Lustre piece, as well as their Windows Files capability, et cetera. So it's just kind of that ongoing upgrade and improvement of performance, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah. So those, from a kind of storage resiliency standpoint, those were a couple of the ones that really jumped out to me. And like you mentioned, Camberley, I know Dave covered a number of others as well. So the link to that full write-up will be in the show notes for those who are interested.
All right, cool. Thank you. Okay, so our big topic today is talking about the Share Conference. So for us mainframe bigots, I go back to the 3033.
Bigots, fanboys, fangirls. I mean, hey.
So let's put that in place, back into putting big boxes into the big boxes that would show up on trucks.
Well, they're not as big as they used to be.
No, they're not. They're not.
A couple of generations.
How many people were there?
Generations ago, they went to 19-inch racks, so they're no bigger than anything else these days. And then in the last version, they put them so you could put them in your own rack. So they're now rack mounted. So gone are the days where a mainframe fills a room.
Yeah. So how many people were at the conference? And they're all gray heads?
No, you'd be surprised, actually. I mean, that's the perception, right?
Uh-huh.
I had a chance on the final day to interview some college kids. The community's done a really good job over the last probably 5 or 6 years of acknowledging that there's a skills gap. You've still got a bunch of the people who've been around the industry for years, but there's a lot more focus. Broadcom's doing some really good work with a Beyond Code program to place people into the community and really sponsor their first year working at a customer, so that they can get the skills, because it's a chicken and egg problem, right? You've got to get somebody to get the skills, but people don't have the skills. Employers don't want to recruit somebody that doesn't have the skills. So Broadcom's done a good job of kind of picking on that piece. I had dinner on Wednesday night with one of the guys going through that program, and he's getting a lot of training, a lot of sort of involvement, and Broadcom's funding that first year of this gentleman's career, placing them at a company after the first 6 to 8 weeks of training, and they're even funding that first sort of year. So the conference has changed. I've been going for probably 10 years, and it's really changed. There's a lot more college kids and younger stage professionals, but there's about 1,500, 2,000 people at the conference. It's a pretty techie event. I had a chance to speak to Scott Fagan, the president of Share. It's a user event, so it's not a vendor-sponsored kind of vendor-centric event. Although the vendors have got booths and kind of bring a lot of people, it's a real community event. So they're back to where they were pre-COVID, which I think is good. I think the biggest takeaway for me was, and it's linked to what you were just saying, Krista, around some of the storage piece. I had a chance to speak to Eddie Chiliendo from 21CS about some of the announcements that 21CS and IBM have done around cloud object storage. I think the innovation that's going on in the cloud object storage space is now very definitely connected to the mainframe space.
So is that cloud object storage the IBM's cloud object storage, or is that a different cloud object storage you're talking about? Because they have a class.
Yeah, any cloud you want.
Okay, so you're using it as a generic term as opposed to their branded term. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a lot of acknowledgement that people are going to be on AWS, they're going to be on Microsoft, they're going to be on Google. I didn't catch actually whether there is a connection to the IBM cloud object storage. I would assume so, but I'd need to check.
Yeah.
The other piece we did had the CEO of Virtual Z. They call it Virtual Z, but I'm British, so it's still Z in my world. And they're doing solutions for connectivity to and from the public cloud with regard to data. So I think we're kind of at an inflection point of the mainframe used to be connected to ECKD, big, multi-tier, expensive storage from, HPE, Hitachi, EMC. I think we're certainly for the backup tier and looking at where sort of the VTL part of the market is. I think the mindset is shifting of, do we need virtual tape libraries on-prem connected to our mainframe, or do we need that data up in the cloud? So the solution.
We did some work on that last. Yeah, sorry. We did some work last year. Yeah, we did some work on that last year when Randy presented at Share. I believe it was at Share last year when we did that work for them. So.
Yeah, I mean, BMC's got solutions in that space with the acquisition of Model 9.
Yeah.
Broadcom's got solutions with their CA1 piece. We've now seen IBM and 21CS kind of collaborate in this space. So I think that's good that there's competition and customers have got options. I think they all validate that the model is moving to the cloud for certainly that VTL and immutable copy. All the things you were just talking about there, Krista, as technology on the other end, are now being seen as targets for the mainframe, which is fantastic.
Absolutely.
So the what was probably the big focus for the conference this year? I mean, last year, of course, we had the release of the new Z, so it was all like super excited.
So the big sort of thing this year was, and I was involved in this back in the day when I was at IBM, was there's a open source project within the Open Mainframe project, and where I'm using their Yeti cooler today. The Open Mainframe project was set up back in 2015 as an open source sort of community around the mainframe. And one of the big projects, probably the biggest project, had its 5th birthday at the show. This is a really strong collaborative effort around really modernizing some of the interfaces and GUIs and some of the kind of stuff that maybe has held the mainframe back. Back in the day, Broadcom, Rocket, and IBM donated a code base that they'd been collaborating on. And since that's been picked up and really become the biggest code base within this Linux Foundation collaborative project. So those guys were all celebrating their sort of 5th anniversary of the project. That was probably the big news at the show. A lot of vendors kind of use Share as a way to sort of launch minor releases. There was a ZOS release about a week before the show. So I've got to dig in on that with Matt Whitbourne, the product manager for that. We sort of spoke at the show. So there's some good things there around the ZOS, 3. release. But I think open source on the mainframe, which kind of still sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people. You don't kind of see the mainframe as a platform for open source, but I think it's now moving to the point where it's mainstream adoption.
So are we seeing, the mainframe has been there, and as somebody says, Social Security runs on mainframe, so, for the rest of our lives, whatever age you are, 100 years from now, you're going to be getting your check from that mainframe, because the amount of code that's there, just rewriting that would be absolutely ridiculous. But are we seeing any new real applications showing up on the mainframe, or is it still historical that is staying there, is not going anywhere? So we'll maintain and update, the applications and that sort of thing. But is it changing at all?
Well, I think you've got two speeds. You've got people looking at modernizing the applications that they've got. Number of different approaches for that. I think the guys at Kyndryl have got a really good sort of route for that. It's modernize the application you've got where it is.
Yeah.
Modernize it with the cloud, something we were just talking about, maybe bring cloud object storage, or maybe, there's other services that you change the mix. So there's a mainframe component and a cloud component. And then the final option for some of the workloads is, it should never have been on a mainframe. It was there for legacy reasons, and you should modernize it and take it off. So I think there's kind of 3 buckets of activity going on. So that's the kind of one piece around those core ZOS VSE type workloads. The other piece is Linux on the mainframe is growing like gangbusters. It's one of the fastest growing parts of IBM right now. They launched a Linux One, Linux-only variation based on the same chip architecture back in 2015. That is getting huge traction with some of the big players now who are looking at maybe database as a service within their own infrastructure. So Citi have done a big job around consolidating MongoDB, for instance, onto Linux One. So that's just a big...
And onto a mainframe. So Linux One with MongoDB sitting on a mainframe, which is not...
Well, it all depends what you define as a mainframe. I mean, it's a
Linux... Exactly, right. Exactly, yeah. So is, however we're using it is some of the big systems that we have. So it's kind of like rethinking, what we really see as terms of what is the hardware. Like I was talking about with the open systems, the OCP kind of things, the unique architecture that's going on, design that's happening,
Well, yeah, I mean, the S390X chip architecture that runs on the Telum processor, it's the same Telum processor that runs in the Z16, but it's a different box.
Mm-hmm.
From a Linux person's going to log on to that box, there's going to be no mainframe-ness about it. It's just a big Linux server running RHEL, running Slares, running CentOS, Debian. There's all the major variants of Linux that run on this box. It's just a Linux server at the end of the day.
Yeah, exactly. So awesome. Anything else that you want to bring up from Share, or some of the other stuff we're talking about?
I mean, but we recorded a whole bunch of videos, some good stuff that the team at BMC are doing. Yeah. We recorded 4 videos with those. We'll put the links to those in the show notes. Really a strong focus on DevOps from those guys. Really I've covered in the past what they're doing around DORA metrics and really looking to change that entire developer experience. So I got a chance to spend some time with Dave Jeffries, their VP of product management over there. We recorded a session on the show, but got really chance over dinner to have a chat with him and dig into what they're doing. Some fascinating stuff, some good announcements coming out of those guys again, which we'll cover in the videos. But I think it's really interesting for me. People see that kind of mainframe space, small vendors, relatively new vendors, startups. It's a pretty vibrant ecosystem. Obviously, big established names like IBM and Broadcom and BMC that have been around for decades in that space, but also a rich startup ecosystem, and those startups getting bought and lots of consolidation. So a microcosm of the industry.
Well, that would be our wrap up for Share. If we got anything else, Krista, you want to bring up on here? Otherwise, we'll kind of wrap it up for the day and talk to you next week. How about that?
Fantastic.
Sounds good to me.
And
click and subscribe. Do all
well,
those.
I'm about to say that I'm
Yes.
going to click and subscribe. Thank you very much. Enjoy your week, and we will love to see you guys. Well, one of these days we have to see all the people that are watching us. Fun. All right, Krista, thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much. Have a great day, folks.
Thank you all.